My name is Joshua Myers, and today's date is May 17, 2017, and this is the Black Power Chronicles interview for Jennifer Lawson. Jennifer Karen Lawson was born on June 8, 1946, in Fairfield, Alabama. Her father, Willie D. Lawson, was the owner of a repair shop, and her mother, Velma Lawson, was a retired school teacher. She's the second of 5 children: Willie D., Frankie, James, and Skylar. Lawson attended Tuskegee University briefly before dropping out and dedicating her time to the civil rights movement. She has worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the National Council of Negro Women, where she has worked on self-empowerment programs for rural women. She has also worked as a deputy director for an adult education program in Mississippi's Quitman County. Lawson eventually relocated to Washington, D.C., where she worked as art director for Drum and Spear, a bookstore and publishing company. In 1970, Lawson moved to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, as coordinator of a joint publishing project, and it was here that she decided to study film. After getting her MFA from Columbia University in 1974, Lawson worked in programming in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS before founding her Magic Box Media Works. Thank you, Ms. Lawson, for joining us today.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Josh.
So the first question that we want to consider here for Black Power Chronicles is to really speak to your background. What was it like growing up in Alabama in the 1950s and the 1960s, and how did that prepare the ground for what you would become later in life?
Fairfield, Alabama, which is a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama, was an almost untenable place in many ways for people of color. For African Americans, you were relegated towards communities that were impoverished for the most part, and it was one where there was segregation was the rule of the land. I mean, George Wallace was the governor of Alabama for a good portion of that time, and that there are many, many clips, video clips of him saying segregation now, segregation forever. And that was you had the white citizens councils, you had other organizations that worked along with the police, particularly the infamous police chief Bull Connor, to ensure that blacks then were repressed. So it was a very, very repressive atmosphere. One of the things that shaped me in many ways was the response of the African American community. It is very heartening for me to know that in those circumstances, in the worst of circumstances, you often see the best of people. And for middle class African Americans and the wealthiest African Americans like A.G. Gaston, who was a millionaire who lived in Birmingham, that we were all one in many ways. We were quite united. A.G. Gaston and his family then would mingle and meet with people who were really just had been sharecroppers and now were mine workers and were on the verge of being homeless. And so you had this real mixture of classes, mixture of people of various education groups. And one of the things that united us was our desire to stand tall and to thrive as much as possible in the face of all of that repression.
Sure. The institutional life in the black community, churches, civic organizations, what was its role, even before we get to the quote-unquote movement, in helping develop your community?
You had men and women who had their own businesses. My father had his own business, and many other people were entrepreneurs and had their own business. So we had our little parallel universe. I grew up in many ways in a bubble where we had black doctors, black dentists, black pharmacists, black ministers. So you had this world, and black newspapers, and that was a world that sought to nurture you and protect you from this very, very threatening world that was right outside your door. So it was, it varied. There were some ministers who were very supportive. There were other, movement-like activities and allowed their churches to be meeting places. There were others who their notion of being protective was to say, let's stay out of this.
Sure.
Let's trust in the Lord,
Yes.
and let's stay out of this. That the Lord, will provide a way, and so let's just stay out of this and assume that this is the way that God wants things to be. And as you might tell, I gravitated towards those who then were who felt much more that we should provide the solutions.
Yes. So that's kind of Black Power in some ways.
Yes.
This attempt to create a safe space or a institutional kind of foundation for the Black community in the midst of the things that were happening external to our communities. This kind of autonomy that you begin to see, right?
Well, and I didn't think of it as a child growing up in that circumstance. I, of course, didn't think of it as Black Power, nor did I think of it as autonomy, but I must say that it gave me an incredible amount of confidence in our ability to govern, our ability to do things, our ability as people of color to, for me, the sky was the limit, but I felt that there was this repressive circumstance that we were living in, and that it wasn't, to me, a situation that was ordained to be. Absolutely. That I did feel, even as a child, that we did not have to live under those circumstances. And I think partly that was due to my family, that even though we were poor, we traveled. And so as a child, my father we would go on road trips in our old car, used car. We'd go to Canada, we'd go to New York City, and I went to all of the Smithsonian museums and other museums when I was a small child, and we'd go to California, and on our way to and from California, we'd go into Mexico. So I had a sense of a broader world, and we were encouraged to read. And so books became also a way to me, a window into a much larger world.
Absolutely.
So for me and my siblings, that was something that we were exposed to, and I gravitated towards friends in school, particularly in high school, who shared that same sort of vision of a larger world.
That's absolutely critical in terms of how we understand, the impetus to want to change the local conditions by having a sense of how things existed beyond that. I'm really curious to know some of your favorite books during that period. Yeah.
Oh, it's really interesting. I remember at some point I got a hold of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
Oh, wow.
And Birmingham is an interesting place because it was coal mining.
It's industrial. Yeah.
It's very industrial. And it's now one of those forsaken places where it's where you see it's the Rust Belt now in many ways, even though it's trying to reinvent itself. But I grew up in a circumstance where my father took me to sort of some of the union meetings when people were declaring strikes, and so I knew who John L. Lewis was in terms of a union leader. I knew what the principles of strikes and scabs, and I saw company towns where people really lived in near slavery-like conditions. My father would repair things for people and do it on a barter basis because the people didn't get cash. They got script from the company. Wow. And that was money that could only be spent at the company store. Wow. As opposed to out in the real world.
Like Pratt City?
Yes, Pratt City. Honestly, Powderly was one that's Powderly, Brighton, near Bessemer, those places were particularly like that. So it was an interesting landscape to come of age in. So Upton Sinclair became then one of the books. Dostoevsky, so Crime and Punishment, and some of the other books like that were quite interesting to me. There was one point at which the Fountainhead and some of those other
interesting.
Yeah. came my way. And you'll find it interesting to know that there was, in Birmingham, I would go from Fairfield to downtown Birmingham with some regularity to take music lessons. Okay. And so you'd take the segregated bus down to downtown Birmingham, and I'd take music lessons. And there was one part of Birmingham, though, that was a little sort of bastion of liberalism in a way. And it was this place, and there was a bookstore, Crutcher's Bookstore.
Okay.
And at that bookstore, the owner had books and magazines that went beyond the, sort of the Bible and two other versions of the life of Jesus that many of the other bookstores had, or Red Book magazine. And that it was a place where I then would go to buy books, and that sometimes that the owner would recommend books to me as well.
Okay.
And that it was a fascinating little exchange that was taking place there. I don't know what he thought of this, black kid who was coming from Fairfield to his bookstore and buying these books. But I remember also I became quite addicted to Paul Krasner's The Realist. And this was a magazine of that time that was sort of like the Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart in a print form. And it was satire, and Lenny Bruce and others associated with it. But it had that level of political satire about it, and it was sort of the best thing. I couldn't wait until a new issue was out.
You mentioned the union and labor. To what extent was that activism interracial? And I guess as a follow-up to that, do you have any recollection or personal memories of the Communist Party USA because of the influence of the Scottsboro Boys and how they were able to come into Alabama during that period? And there were many African Americans who joined the Communist Party as a result.
Right, and I later learned that, but as a child growing up in those circumstances, it wasn't something that I was aware of in that way. I had a childhood friend who became very active later with a socialist group. I don't think it was the Communist Party. I do have, I know some people who actually joined the Communist Party, but in Birmingham, I didn't know anyone who was an active Communist Party member, or who even mentioned. Things were so repressive, though. I mean, we're talking about a time when the Rosenbergs were, executed, and when the whole Red Scare was there. There were billboards in Alabama on main roads then that said Martin Luther King Jr. is a communist. And so communism was a real dirty word in that sense.
Absolutely. And the unions, was it interracial or? The
unions that I knew of, the meetings that I went to with my father were not interracial to my knowledge. I never saw white people in them, and I never saw them having a relationship. The adults in my world, to my knowledge, did not have relationships with white people aside from the awful ones where it's, hey boy, what you doing here kind of horror stories, yeah.
Interesting. Let's move on to your college years. So you went to Tuskegee.
I did, yes.
What was the environment like there? Because we know about, how the Tuskegee machine comes about, and we hear about that era, late 19th century, early 20th century, but we never hear about student life and the dynamics on campus by the time we get to the mid 20th century. So let's start there and kind of get a sense of how being on campus shaped you.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that one of the books that was also really important to me was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man.
Yes.
And that it was, when I was then at Tuskegee, I felt that, this is, this is the place that this book is about, without a doubt. And it's, but the Tuskegee was for me, first of all, the campus, let's talk about the campus life. There were, to understand this, it's really important to understand when I was there. I went to Tuskegee in 1963, in the fall of 1963. So I went there in late August, early September of 1963. So you just had the March on Washington had just taken place. And that we are talking about a time then where civil rights activity is beginning to bubble up. Martin Luther King and the organizations, that's really well known. And that here we are, we then are meeting each other at Tuskegee as students for the first time in that fall, and that I am surprised at how little the students there care, the majority of students there care about civil rights or about reading the New York Times or trying to find out what's happening in the larger world. That it was a place where there were people who, I was struck by the people who sort of said, oh, and I'm here to marry a doctor.
Wow.
I'm here because I want to marry somebody who's going to be a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, and that it was skin color. The conversation was, so there were these appalling conversations that helped me understand the sort of broader world. I was being exposed to a broader world of a range of black people and the kind of prejudices that they had. I mean, African and West Indian students were being called by very derogatory terms. And, you know, people would sort of say, oh, you're not going to sit next to her, are you? You know, she's from Africa. You know, they don't use deodorant, they don't, and it's like, what? And I met, you know, so I became, with that, I began to sort of be a rebel in many ways in the face of the kind of insularity and xenophobia that my fellow students were showing.
Yes.
And so that was one of the things about student life. So I then was rejecting the traditional student life. And there were many people who Tuskegee was nirvana for them. They were in heaven. They loved being in the AKAs and in the Deltas and the Omegas. And so all of the Greek life that was happening on the campus was just a rich, you know, world for them. The football games, the Commodores with Lionel Richie were right off campus at some of the little juke joints. And so it was a new bubble in that way. It was a new bubble. And that I kept breaking out of the bubble though, because I knew that right outside the campus gates, you couldn't go to some of the stores in downtown Tuskegee. And there were incredibly wealthy people, and there were a lot of professionals who lived in Tuskegee proper because they worked at the VA hospital. You know, this was in connection with the Tuskegee as a base for the airmen, the famed Tuskegee Airmen. So Tuskegee had this a sizable middle class and very well-educated group of people who lived there in that little town. But the students were just sort of had narrowed into, you know, typical student life in many ways there. And it was, for me, I recall that I thought the isolation would break and the bubble would sort of be burst when President Kennedy was assassinated, because that was something that did come into that world. That was now the news of the world coming into that little space. But it was after the shock of that, you know, sort of the wave of the shock of that went through the campus, people were ready to go back to the usual campus life. And I became, I met other students who shared my thinking about being aware and active about the contradictions that were taking place both there on the campus and in the community out around it. And we then had a student group. And Gwen Patton, who recently passed away, Dr. Gwendolyn Patton, was one of the activists in that George Ware, or as he referred to himself, George Washington Ware, who later ended up working with the Funkadelics, was a part of that. And there were Samuel Schultz, but there were a number of students who then, Wendy Parrish, we then became like a little core group of student activists. And that, so we then would, on weekends and after school, we would go and demonstrate and integrate some of the businesses off campus, and that we also then began to look at what the politics of Macon County, Tuskegee is located in Macon County, and we began to look at the politics of the county. I met at that time an older retired professor, Dr. Gomillion, and that he had done work on gerrymandering and explained to me what gerrymandering was. And I was appalled to find out how the sort of, while people had the right to vote, that their vote was being canceled out by the ways in which then the districts were being redrawn to eliminate the power of the black vote. So those things became sort of cranked my mind up on some of the politics of the place, and that Michael Lomax, who now heads the United Negro College Fund, his mother ran a newspaper out of Tuskegee. She was in Los Angeles, but she ran a newspaper and that talked about some of the political problems of Macon County and Tuskegee. So those were things that then heightened my awareness.
Sure, sure. It's interesting that you made the connection between the students and their class attitudes, which would have been a different dynamic than where you grew up in Birmingham, because you talked about how kind of race collapsed, the kind of class differences in Birmingham, and yet at Tuskegee you saw people make different kinds of decisions and choices about life based on their class situation. Where were the students coming from? All across the country?
All across the country, all across the world,
Across the
really.
world.
Yeah, you had people who were coming from African countries. I met a student, a woman that I saw when I was living in East Africa, who had come from Uganda, and that she studied and later became a doctor, a medical doctor in Uganda. So you had people from the West Indies and from different parts of Africa who.
What were their attitudes towards Jim Crow?
Oh, I mean, they.
International students.
Yeah, I mean, it was. They were appalled, but they were also under circumstances where they sort of felt that they needed to just plow through, get out of school, get through their education, and go home. So they weren't there to sort of start a fight of any kind.
How did you come to SNCC?
I came to SNCC because we were Gwen Patton, George Ware, George Davis. All of us were doing our student activities, and that continued for several years. And so we move up to a point where we're in the mid, like 1964, 1965. In 1964, you had the Freedom Summer, and I was working in New York. I had gotten, for 63 and 64, I'd gotten a fabulous internship, where it was a paid internship to work at Sloan Kettering Memorial Institute for Cancer Research. At that time, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and so that was an incredible opportunity for me. But it also meant that I didn't participate in the March on Washington because I was in New York at, doing my internship, and I also didn't participate in Freedom Summer. And so when I was back at Tuskegee in the fall of '64, and this is now right after the bodies had been found of the 3 civil rights workers. The SNCC and the other groups, COFO, asked for student volunteers to go to Mississippi to work there on the election and work on the campaign of getting out the vote. And I think that this was like a Johnson-Humphrey ticket or something. And so I then felt that, well, since I had missed Freedom Summer, I would go. And that there were, most people were reluctant to even consider it because they felt that, oh God, Mississippi, I mean, they just killed 3 people, and they found, while they were looking for their bodies, they found other bodies, and people had this notion that Mississippi was this horrendous place. And I felt that how could I kid myself? I lived in Alabama. You know, that Mississippi is right next door. You drive, there's no border, you just drive right into it. And I've been there, and so I was not afraid of Mississippi. I mean, I couldn't claim to be afraid of Mississippi while I was living in Alabama, which was the same kind of place. And that I then volunteered to go over. And so I worked for 2 weeks in Jackson, Mississippi, then canvassing for voters for that campaign, and came back. I met some SNCC people then, but it gave me a sense of what organizing in a rural area was like and what canvassing meant. And then I came back, and the next year, we, 65, a larger group of us at Tuskegee became very, very active when Martin Luther King and others were in the area for the Selma to Montgomery marches. And during that time, I was arrested a group of us students, and James Foreman wrote extensively about this in his book on Sammy Young Jr. But my classmate, Sammy Young, who was one of the activists in the movement, was killed. And that but before Sammy's death, a number of us had participated in demonstrations in Montgomery, and we went on marches in support of what King and others were doing with the Selma to Montgomery march. So they were coming from Selma, we came from Tuskegee, and were marching around the state capitol there. And at that time, then I was arrested and spent a week in jail there. And that as in all of those interactions, then I was interacting with SNCC people. And it was interesting, there was a point at which there was some division among us college students about whether SNCC and Jim Foreman, William Winkie Hall, some of the other SNCC activists were saying, oh, why don't you join SNCC? And we were saying, well, we have our own student group here. And there was this, sort of it was something we had to really think about as to whether we would continue with our studies in school and continue as student activists through our student group or work with SNCC. And I ultimately decided that I would leave school and work with SNCC full time.
Was that because of the conversations that you had within your student group? Was it because of the people that you met that were recruiting you to SNCC? Explain your thought process.
My thought process at the time, I felt that I was very torn and dividing myself between two worlds, and I was in sort of an unsustainable situation, that I was trying to be a student, and that I had been a good student, and now I was not being as good a student as possible because I was being so active with the movement. But then there were times when there were things that I needed to do with the movement that I couldn't participate in because I had a final or whatever. So it was, these two worlds were pulling at me, and that I sort of thought, for me it was the notion of, okay, you're talking about becoming a doctor. Why did you want to become a doctor? And I felt, well, I want to help my people, and that being a doctor, I could do things that would be, provide healing and services to people. And then I realized that, well, what that might affect a small number of people, the people who would be my patients, while if I could do whatever I could to help change the awful circumstances of segregation, the awful circumstances of the majority of people not being able to vote and living such second-class lives, that would affect a larger number of people. And so I thought that it was much more important to become an activist because there were so few people who were willing to go that route, while I thought that there would be an ample supply in the world of doctors and lawyers and other professionals.
Absolutely.
So I thought that's the route that I will take. And it was a big decision for me because, as I mentioned, I came from a poor family, and that I had to pay my own way through college, through both undergraduate and graduate school. And that so I had the good fortune to get a scholarship that was a full scholarship, and that in making the decision to leave Tuskegee, then I was relinquishing that. And there was no clear route to how do you return and how do you, so.
How was that conversation with your family, your parents?
My mother had passed away some years earlier, and so it was just my father, and my father had this kind of iconoclastic, very different perspective on it. Was that he had sort of much earlier sort of says, hey, you're on your own. If you want to eat, you work. And so from the time I was 12 years old, I had been working. And so it was much more a decision that I felt I had to make for myself. It wasn't as though I felt that I had parents who were going to help me in life or, be there for me in that way. So it was much more, I'm out here on my own, so this is a decision that I need to think carefully about because it's going to be my decision.
Thank you. So what were the conversations like among SNCC activists, particularly as you all were canvassing in Mississippi in the wake of what happens in Atlantic City? how did, those experiences, did they begin to challenge your beliefs in like normative American democracy and the, contradictions that even in organizing people at the highest levels within the Democratic Party, that this wasn't enough, that there needs to be something more?
Well, those were the real discussions that I had of that nature. Didn't take place so much in Mississippi, because in Mississippi we were much more engaged in just sort of the logistics of the day. How many people did you talk to today? How many, what areas did you cover? So it was much more the logistics as opposed to a larger philosophical discussion. The people that I met through SNCC, when I actually left and started working in SNCC, then and now we're talking about 1965, 1966. Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Cleveland Sellers, Judy Richardson, Cynthia Washington, Ruth Howard Chambers, the list goes on and on, Karen Spellman, the list goes on. But those were the places, it was conversations with those individuals where we would talk about what are we doing and why are we doing it. And so it was, we understood the importance of the vote. We felt that you couldn't, it was the old discussions that had been had and made public with others, where it was like, okay, enough of the lunch counter business. What will it profit you to integrate a lunch counter if you don't have the money to buy a sandwich?
Sure.
And how do you get then to a place where you can have better resources? And for all of the problems that people of color, particularly African Americans, had, that it was, it seemed as if when we look, we connect the dots to say, well, in order to solve this, that you just don't want to be out here complaining about what the police did to you or what the sheriff did to you. It's much better to, that if you are in the majority, why not vote and become the sheriff? Why not have your neighbor as the sheriff and then hold him or her accountable? Why not have people that you know and people that you feel you can definitely talk back to in those positions, particularly if you're in the majority? And for the black belt counties of Alabama, that was very definitely the case. You had African Americans who were in the majority. So that was something that made me feel that we had a clear path to, the logic of that seemed impeccable to me. And that this person, Jack Minnis, who was the researcher, the lead researcher at SNCC in Atlanta at the SNCC headquarters, he had done an analysis of the black belt counties and had realized that you could run for office without going through the traditional structures of the Democratic and Republican parties, that you could have these independent organizations. And so SNCC was beginning to develop a project on the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And so I then worked on that with Cortland Cox, Ralph Featherstone, and a number of other people.
So you outlined the assumptions behind it. What did it look like in practice to be able to develop and craft independent black politics during this time?
In practice, it looked like the usual hard work of doing anything, which is it requires a lot of time, commitment, perseverance, and so it meant knocking on doors, going out, talking to sharecroppers, meetings at night, meetings on weekends with people, and we're talking now pre-phones, pre-cell phones, pre-fax machines, so we're talking about running things off on the mimeograph machine. See, I still have that motion there, but running things off on mimeograph machines to make copies to give to people. And then I also realized the high rate of illiteracy and the fact that then just even when we're doing these flyers, that you didn't have a lot of people who actually could read and write. That's how bad the education system in a lot of these places were. So we started talking about, well, how do we communicate more effectively? And to that end, I had been sort of an amateur artist and would draw things. And so I started drawing little cartoons, like comic book-like drawings, to talk about, well, what would the role of the sheriff be? And what would the, so it was like a version of a hand, PowerPoint or something but that we would use these as tools then in our organizing work. So I'd make these little comic books, one step above stick figures, but it was, they were helpful in being something that we could have people focus on and get ideas across. And that also led to my work in Lowndes County, where when we were getting towards the election and we wanted to communicate to people all over the county and wanted to try to avoid any violence, and we were concerned about their safety, that we then, I said, well, it would be great if we could have billboards. And I said, if somebody could get me the lumber, I could make billboards. And so I painted 3 or 4 billboards that we posted around Lowndes County on land that was owned by black landowners, and that it said, vote for the Black Panther and go home. And the Black Panther was, of course, the symbol of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And that was the original, so to speak, Black Panther Party.
Sure. Why the Black Panther?
The Black Panther, because the people in Lowndes County said that you, first let's back up and recognize that because of this problem with literacy that you had for both blacks and whites in Alabama at that time, symbols for the parties were incredibly important. So people would often just look for the symbol, their party symbol, when they went in to vote. So the symbol was quite important, and the white Lowndes County Party, the Democratic Party there, had as its symbol a white rooster. And so John Hewlett, who was the head of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a local person there, said that, boy, it'd be great if we had a mean black cat to run that old white rooster out of this county. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but that was the idea. And so he said, that's what we needed, a Black Panther. We needed a black cat to run. And so we began to look for an image, and people in Lowndes County asked the SNCC office in Atlanta if they could send something, and Ruth Howard Chambers sent then this symbol down that I would hand draw and copy many times. That the symbol, though, was really the Clark College football mascot from Clark in Atlanta.
Were you involved with the attempts to export this idea across the country?
No, I wasn't. I was very focused on our work in Lowndes County. And there were people who came from other places, from Philadelphia, and activists came from other places because they were in awe of what was taking place in Lowndes County. But I was not actively going to other places to try to sort of spread the idea. I participated with many of our colleagues. We continued to try to refine our thinking and to look at our wins and losses, and to think about what does it mean, and how can one be effective. And that was something that led me, after Lowndes County, I left Lowndes County and began to work at one point with the National Council for Negro Women. And that I kept feeling that if we thought we had it bad as black people, that the people who were in even worse circumstances were black women, because I had seen so many instances of domestic abuse or domestic bullying, or just women who were so incredibly smart who were not sort of being able to live to their full potential. And so I thought that here was an opportunity to work with rural women and with women in some of the poorest places in the country to help them. And that the National Council of Negro Women at that time had an economic project in Mississippi, economic development project for women in Mississippi. And it had come about because of that Mississippi, there had been a number of stories about how there was hunger in America, and how that Mississippi was in such terrible shape that there were actually people who showed signs like you would have in a third world country, particularly children, of starvation. And so there was this whole notion of sending food aid, but then the National Council of Negro Women had thought, well, what if we can provide ways for people to be more entrepreneurial as well as to provide food? So I then worked on a project like that, and I had the honor of working with Fannie Lou Hamer, very closely with Fannie Lou Hamer, and with another incredible woman, Unita Blackwell, who became the mayor of Myersville, Mississippi. And Fannie Lou Hamer was in Ruleville, Mississippi. So these were my days of driving all over the state of Mississippi to manage these projects that we had going there.
Did you leave SNCC to work there, or
I left SNCC to work there.
Okay.
And I left SNCC in part too because I felt that I wasn't clear, and I felt we weren't clear about where we were heading at that point. That SNCC had always been an organization in transition and in change. There are waves of it. SNCC for me is like a river, and your SNCC depends on when you stepped into the river. You know, some people stepped in when the current was cold, others stepped in when it was warm, and some when it was flowing very full. But that's how it was to me. So that I came in at a point when Marion Barry and John Lewis were still a part of SNCC. By the time I was truly a part of SNCC, they were no longer in SNCC, and that then, so I was, in a part where there was a whole group of people with whom I feel very, very close to this day, and feel that it's a lifetime of closeness. We'll always be, as they say, a band of brothers and sisters in that respect. So it was the next wave, though, were people who were like Rap Brown,
right.
And
the whole Atlanta Declaration.
Right.
Moment.
And it was some of the people from Atlanta. They had come in at the same time I had, like Zohara Simmons and others. But that I thought that it wasn't quite clear where we were going, and so at that point, I felt that it was time to move on. And this was also at a time when Stokely had been the chair, he had been the chairperson of SNCC, and that it was prior to Stokely's ascendancy, after Willie Ricks made the call for Black Power,
right.
With the Meredith March Against Fear, that after that, Stokely was changing too, because it was one of the things that we had been is that we had been a true organization in many ways, where the people who appeared on television or something, Julian Bond or Stokely or John Lewis, they were the spokesperson for the organization. But the thought and everything was more collectively of the organization. But now we had come to a point where the cameras were sort of saying, Stokely, we want to hear what you think. And so it was now about individual leadership and charismatic leadership, and about the individual, not about the group. So it didn't matter where SNCC was on a particular issue. It's where's Stokely on this? And
so that you said that altered the kind of internal politics of the organization.
Right, exactly, exactly. So I felt that it's very difficult in that circumstance to have a coherent organization when you have a person who can then say, who speaks for the organization, and the organization then either has to follow in lockstep or be in contradiction with whatever the leader has said. So it's no longer a spokesperson, and so there's no longer that possibility for me of having this coherent thought and something that I go, okay, I understand the logic of what we are doing.
Right.
Right. So I felt that it was time for me to move on, and that's when I looked for the logic of what I believed in, and went and worked with the National Council of Negro Women.
So this is by 1966, 67.
This is around 1967, 68.
68.
Yeah, and then around that time, I continued, as I said, that it's a lifetime of closeness to my SNCC colleagues. And so with Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Ivanhoe Donaldson, Ralph Featherstone, we are all still really in communication with each other. By then I was running an adult education program, literacy, and the importance to me of education. In Quitman County had been declared the poorest county in Mississippi. So I was working there, and Cortland and Charlie began to talk about the notion of a publishing company, a bookstore, and of doing these things in Washington, D.C. Also the Sixth Pan-African Congress, and that I then went to, in '69, I believe it was, I went to Algiers. I went to Algeria to attend a Pan-African Festival of the Arts.
Yes.
And it was a number of people from many organizations, Haki Mabudi, and a number of people attended that event.
That's the one where Cleaver had the whole, they basically gave them embassy status, right?
Yeah. So I went over and attended that event, and then at that time began to feel that, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful if then there was greater unity in terms of Africa, and that how we should indeed not see ourselves as separate from the Caribbean or from the African world, that the African diaspora, the problems that we experienced in the United States were very akin to problems that were people of African descent were experiencing elsewhere, whether it was Brazil, Colombia, or parts of Africa, all over Africa. So, and this was at a time when Nelson Mandela was still in prison, when South Africa was suffering under apartheid, and when you had Mozambique fighting for its independence. So it was a lot of things happening in the world at that time, and I felt that yes, it would be really important, and this would be useful and meaningful work as well. And so I moved to Washington to in the late '60s to then work with Drum and Spear Press and Drum and Spear Publishing. We had our holding company was Afro-American Resources, Inc. And we had the bookstore, the publishing company. We worked with Kojo Nnamdi and others to do radio programs. A woman, Mildred Hayes, Mimi Hayes. We did a children's program, Saya Watoto, the Children's Hour, and we also did a news program. And that we would, for the children's program, we'd get together and enact these little folk tales and dramas. And so it was a very meaningful experience, and Washington was abuzz with lots of activity and other groups at that time.
Wow. So would you see, as Stokely did, Pan-Africanism as an extension of Black Power?
Very definitely, yes.
Okay. What about African liberation struggles that were going during that particular time resonated most with not only the Black activists, in the diaspora, but average Black people? Why did those struggles inspire this sort of energy? I'm thinking about ALD, and by 1972, where there's thousands, tens of thousands of people in DC and all across the world energized by this. What was it about what was happening that made this happen?
I think that there were the kind of voices of leadership that you had within the African American community that brought attention to those issues. And I think, again, the kind of logic that people saw, there was a kind of hopefulness and a joy of possibilities and of possibilities that of the African world. You also had things like, I've forgotten when it came out, but you had things like Alex Haley's Roots, and as part of kind of the social fabric that people wanted, and people began to think of, yes, who am I? What is my identity? And that was, we had been so very ashamed of not only slavery, but even Southern roots, that we didn't want to identify with that, but suddenly with these kind of cultural phenomena, that there was Gil Scott-Heron, other people, there was the way of seeing ourselves in a much better light. Harry Belafonte, Miriam Makeba. So it was this notion that Africa became something that wasn't then this notion of this horrible place where, like I said, when I went to Tuskegee, you called the students names. But now instead it became this possible connection of a sense where there could be this sense of pride. And so I do think that was a part of this interest. And it was a kind of hopefulness and an aspiration that we could, as people of color, beyond national borders, connect and then embrace each other and have a much more positive outlook.
Yeah. So I think we have time for really one more long question. And it's one that's really close to me because it involves someone that I continue to look up to, CLR James, and him being in DC and how he influenced Drum and Spear and the Center for Black Education. And it's interesting to me because if you take I would say a normative history of civil rights, Black power, it's almost over by the early 1970s. And I'm looking at this as someone who's inspired by James and others and saying that's really the thing, that's the time where it really got, at least ideologically and conceptually, in terms of the activism of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, Fest Act. That's for me a very vibrant time as opposed to a time of decline. And DC is right at the center of this. Right. So what's your perspective of that period, and how did, James's thinking, and let's not forget Amir Carter Brawl and others, who were so influential in helping us tease through the question of capitalism, through the question of racism and imperialism, and how that shaped what becomes of these different organizations by the time you get to the late 1970s and the early 1980s.
Sure, no, I felt very, very honored to have known CLR James, and that I think that I met him first when in Havana.
Wow.
And that in 1966, there was, SNCC had received an invitation to send sort of a delegation of people, and they wanted someone in the arts to go to Havana. And so I was asked to go. It was a conference, a World Congress of Artists in Havana. And so I attended and then spent time there with CLR, and I have some old sketches that I had made of him from back then. And then later, and I met other people, John LaRose, Anthony LaRose, and some other people from the UK who knew him and revered him. And so I also got a sense of CLR in the world. And that when I came here, when I moved here, then CLR was very much a real part of our world, of the Center for Black Education and Drum and Spear and our activities. His book, History of Pan-African Revolt, was one of the first publications of Drum and Spear Press. So it was absolutely terrific, and that what he offered was that kind of Pan-African perspective. It was this sort of sense from, as a sort of a wonderful, generous, mentoring elder of encouraging us to see this broader world and encouraging us to see it in a political light in that way.
Sure.
Through him, I also then met people like Walter Rodney. And Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was yet another important part of that. So it was really great to be a part of this world of scholars and that were scholar activists in many ways too, who then enriched that world.
And so study becomes another theme in your life.
Absolutely.
Particularly during that period.
Education remains absolutely critical. I think that education is absolutely essential to liberation, to freedom. Education and good communications. And so that was one of the reasons that I felt that learning media and trying to keep abreast of the changing media absolutely essential. Being able to communicate
Mm-hmm.
is, it's one thing to know something,
Mm-hmm.
but it's meaningless if you don't communicate it to others.
One final question: How did being involved in SNCC, the National Council of Negro Women, and then later on Drum and Spear, how did that inform your career as a producer in these particular in television and all other kinds of production in media? Did you see it as an extension, and if so, how?
My experiences in the civil rights movement were invaluable, and that they helped me become a manager, and I'd like to think a better manager because of that. And part of it was that you learned focus. You learned you had to, as they say, keep your eyes on the prize. That you had to know, why are you here and what are you doing? And that with that, to then define priorities and stay focused on getting something done. That talk is meaningless. It's what you can accomplish. And that I then became quite focused on that. But it also, I was very fortunate in working in public broadcasting, because public broadcasting shares that objective of media not just for entertainment, that it's great if it's entertaining, but media that also helps to inform people, helps to educate people, helps to give people a sense of the bigger world. And so that was a value that I shared, that came from and was nurtured through my SNCC and civil rights experience, that was shared within the public broadcasting community. So I was very fortunate to be a part of that world for my professional career.
Thank you so much for helping us with this process.
Well, thank you for inviting me to sit down for this interview.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it and appreciate your questions.
You're welcome. Thank you.